Which creature type is best? Today we're going to be breaking down the 14 creature types in D&D 5th edition on this tier list. First up, aberrations. So, aberrations, I think that they are an A tier creature type. These are the weird creatures in D&D 5th edition and across the multiverse. Their most iconic monster, I think, is the Beholder. You could argue Mind Flayers, but Beholders are everywhere. You can build an entire campaign around aberrations and their weirdness. They don't really have a specific archetype. There's no generic aberration. They're just out there. Now, for their best stat block, I'm going to go with the Starspawn Larva Mage. I really just think the Starspawn are really underrated in terms of archetype. Celestial emissaries of these old gods, these elder evils from space, basically, or the far realm. Yeah, they are awesome. And just the sheer variety you're getting with aberrations makes it so I have to put them in A. Now for beasts. I think many people would put them in B, but I have to go C for the beasts, because I think they're just so hit or miss. And, firstly, their highest CR creature is the Tyrannosaurus, and it just feels weird to have dinosaurs and beasts. But even apart from that, the actual beast stat blocks are a little finicky. Cats don't have dark vision, for instance. You're missing stat blocks for a whole bunch of smaller beasts that I would really like, just in terms of being able to use them for polymorph or druid's wild shape. The beasts stop becoming relevant pretty much past 5th level. I'm probably before that. They're so limited with what you can do with beasts, and I understand this is partially for balance purposes. They're kinda one of the worst creature types in that way. Not just because of their overall power level, but because the stat blocks are a little bit weird. I think their most iconic creature is probably the Direwolf. Direwolves appear in so many different campaigns, and are just the kings of low-level random encounters. And of course, their best stat block is the Tyrannosaurus Rex. T-Rex reigns king in this way. So I'm feeling comfortable here with beasts in C tier. Next up, though, we have Celestials. And maybe, again, another little hot take. I got Celestials D tier. Why are the Celestials D tier? You don't have enough stat block. There are so few Celestials, it's just hard to use them in campaigns, and you basically have either two options. The low-level Celestials, which are basically all ally creatures, like something like a Coatl, not a great fighter. Great at being an ally or a support in combat, not a fighter. Or you have the higher level Celestials like Planetars or Solars, which can absolutely run through D&D parties like they're nothing. And it's almost impossible to really implement Celestials into campaigns. I think their most iconic stat block is probably the Unicorn. And Unicorn's obviously very cool. Their best stat block, honestly, I think it's the Planetar, as it is not as powerful as the Solar, but the Solar can absolutely kill entire D&D parties if you're not very careful. The Planetar offers this mid-level, levels 8 to 12 challenge, where if a Planetar comes down, it feels like this emissary from the gods and is powerful enough to show this celestial presence. But it's not crazy enough where you might just completely TPK a party. So D tier for Celestials. They are really underwhelming in D&D 5th edition, and I would love for another book to really flesh them out, because I think we have a severe lack of Celestials right now. Constructs coming up next, and for Constructs, we're going A tier again for Constructs, because Constructs are very versatile. A construct can come from pretty much anywhere from the golems that we all know and love, to things like Modrons. They have good, minion monsters, they have boss monsters. Constructs have a little bit of everything. I think their most iconic stat block is the animated armor, because you can place an animated armor pretty much anywhere in any campaign. Now, their best stat block is the Cadaver Collector. I think this just goes to show the range that constructs have, because the Cadaver Collector is this construct that goes around, collects bodies, and then when you go and you fight it, it can summon specters to help it fight in combat, which is just so cool. Like, that concept, I personally think, is wonderful, and has so much flavor and depth to it. Other stat blocks like the Marut as well, this celestial arbitrator and judge. Anything less than A, I think, is criminal for constructs. Next up, though, dragons. And here's the thing. This game is called Dungeons & Dragons. And Fizban's Treasury of Dragons did improve the dragons, but not by much. I think they're probably top of C, maybe very bottom of B, but I think things are better. And dragons in combat, for the most part, are underwhelming. They are underwhelming creatures to fight. I don't think they have enough hit points, especially if they don't have the chance to fly around. But, if you're going to be fighting dragons in a dungeon and they can't be flying, yeah, that dragon is absolutely toast. The breath weapons are good. I think the saves for some of them are probably a little bit low. But even then, it's just they don't have enough to make them feel like these epic creatures to fight. A dragon really isn't supposed to be a low-level enemy. I would like there to be some lower-level dragon stat blocks. And you do have wormlings and young dragons, but the overall creature type is leaning towards big boss monsters. But they're some of the worst boss fights in D&D, even after their updates. Maybe very much a hot take, but dragons for me are firmly C tier. I think they're just not that good. I need to work and massage dragon stat blocks all the time to make it so that they are actually interesting boss fights. The dragon's most iconic stat block is obviously Tiamat. Tiamat is the prototypical, most iconic dragon, was in the television animated cartoon show, and was the villain of one of the first adventures in D&D 5th edition. I think their best stat block is the Red Great Worm that got dropped in Treasury of Dragons, but there's a lot of just sheer misses when it comes to dragons. Next up, though, Elementals. Elementals, I think, are very good. They're B tier. They're B. They are an average creature type. When you throw an Elemental, it's going to be an interesting combat. They do feel unique, different, leaning into their elemental types. They're not anything to write home about, but they're just really solid creatures to have in a campaign. I think their most iconic actual stat blocker creature is the Fire Elemental. Fire Elementals pop up in pretty much every edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Their best stat block, though, the Invisible Stalker. And this kind of shows what elementals can be, because you can go further than just basic elemental creatures. The Invisible Stalker, a permanently invisible creature that can track down a D&D party, attack them when they are at their weakest, and leads to some really terrifying encounters. Next, though, we have the Fae. Again, might be a little controversial. I think that they were at D tier before the Goblinoids got added to them. And after the Goblinoids became Fae, C. Probably... I don't know. I think the dragons and the Fae are kind of interchangeable. I'm going to put dragons on top because they have better boss fights. But the Fae just don't have a lot going for them right now. You have the goblins, which are interesting. Apart from that, like, what higher level Fae do you have not really anything to challenge a party with. Feels like the Fae have kind of just been forgotten, which is sad because the Fae have hags. The hags and the goblinoids prop up the Fae. Like, the most iconic Fae is probably the green hag, which is, your typical hag that you think of as creating a coven. A good campaign opening enemy, but not really anything to write home about, unfortunately. I think their best stat block is the Quickling, by far, because they are just such interesting little creatures that can torment even higher level parties with their insane movement speed. And you really just don't find anything like a Quickling anywhere else in D&D 5th edition. Just a creature built around being fast, that's a low enough CR where you can throw them into so many combat encounters and it feels natural. I just wish there were more Fae to select from, with good stat blocks. Fae coming in at C tier. Fiends, this is the easiest. S. Fiends have to be S tier. They are iconic in D&D lore. So much variety when it comes to their stat blocks. You can run an entire campaign just throwing fiends at your party members and it will feel easy and natural. Their most iconic stat block, I think it has to be the Demogorgon. The Demogorgon has been around in D&D for so long, but I mean, you could argue Orcus, you could argue, pit fiends or so many other creatures. But it's because you have so many choices for iconic stat blocks that come from fiends. Yeah, it's just such a good creature type that has got so much variety across multiple tiers of play. And then for their best stat block, again, very difficult. You can make a case for literally dozens of stat blocks. I'm going to go with the Dark Horse pick. Just something, a stat block I want to give more attention to, and that's going to be the Night Hag. The Night Hag, I believe, is the perfect low-level villain, tormenting creatures in their dreams, able to shapeshift, has a good selection of spells, decent damage, and just a really solid mechanism for a story, as hags are constantly trying to turn other children into new hags. Surprised the Night Hag isn't in the Fae, which just goes to show you how Wizards of the Coast has taken so much from the Fae and put it into other creature types. Next up, Giants. Giants, probably firmly B for right now. I know Wizards of the Coast is doing more for Giants in the future, and I'm very excited about it. Right now, they're B. I think every Giant is pretty fun and flavorful. They do suffer a bit when it comes to uniqueness. A lot of Giants are just really big sacks of hit points that hit really hard and don't have a lot else going for them. The Giants lore was expanded in Volos and then reworked a bit in Monsters of the Multiverse, and that did give them some new stat blocks, but they don't come anywhere close to Elementals or Aberrations, or not even in the same universe as Fiends. But they're very solid, they're decent, it's fun to fight Giants. For their most iconic stat block, I'm going to pick the Storm Giant, but really any of the basic Giants are kind of iconic. Then for the best stat block, I'm going to go with the Troll. And I love the Troll due to its awesome regeneration ability. New players that don't know the gimmick of a Troll, who fight it and kill a Troll, and then, oh my god, it keeps on getting back up from 0 hit points. Why is it doing that? Then figuring out, we gotta kill it with fire. Wizards of the Coast have gone beyond with the Spirit Troll, and I don't want to spoil what kind of the Spirit Troll's little gimmick is. They're just really fun enemies to fight. Trolls, Ettins, Ogres, Hill Giants. Actually, just with some of that, I think the Giants are probably ahead of Elementals, just because they have so many really fun stat blocks in there. Next up, though, Humanoids. And Humanoids I'm putting at the top of B, just because they are kind of the standard in D&D 5th edition. So many of your low-level basic enemies are Humanoids, but you can be fighting Humanoids easily into higher levels. They are pretty much every NPC stat block. There's so much that you can do with Humanoids. They are completely unlocked when it comes to variety. Most iconic stat block, so many options. I'm going to go Bandit. It was between the Bandit stat block and the Guard stat block, quite honestly. For the best stat block, Gnolls. I just like having evil races in D&D. Races that we can fight and just kill with impunity. Because not everything needs to be a moral conundrum. And Gnolls are just evil creatures that we can fight. And their stat block makes them a decent enemy until later levels. The Rampage ability that Gnolls have when they reduce a creature to 0 hit points so they can make another attack is really flavorful. The Gnoll variety as well when it comes to Gnoll commanders and Flynns and things like that is fantastic. I'm a big fan of Gnolls in general. I'm not even talking about so many stat blocks that come with things like Dwagar or Drow that are also in Humanoid. All the general archetypes for things like Druids or Wizards. It's just a diverse creature type. I think it has to be top of B. Monstrosities now. And I think Monstrosities coming in probably middle of A. And this is because the Monstrosities, again, are so flavorful and have so much variety in it. These are your typical monsters that you're going out into the forest or into the cave to fight, and each monster stat block does generally feel extremely unique from one another. I gave 2 iconic creatures to show the variants. It's between the Tarask, which is supposedly the king of D&D combat, it's the big monster, or you can also go with something like the Mimic, because Mimics are also monstrosities. Again, I would think a Mimic should actually be more fey, just in terms of the shape changing and the trickery. But yeah, they're monstrosities. Just 2 completely different creatures that are brought under the monstrosity umbrella, and the monstrosity type just has so much variety. I would love a druid subclass that allowed you to turn into monstrosities. That would be absolutely epic. But I think wizards would be too scared, and I think that there would be people out there that would be extremely upset because they think it would be busted. And it might be a busted subclass, but it would be so much fun. Next up, though, Oozes. And I think the Ooze comes in bottom of B. The Oozes are an extremely iconic type. For instance, the most iconic creature for the Ooze, the Gelatinous Cube. A favorite of dungeon masters everywhere. It's just a fun monster to fight, getting absorbed by this 5-foot cube that's squelching down a dungeon hall. But the thing that holds the Oozes back is there's just not that many of them. And also, fighting Oozes can sometimes be really annoying. Like things like a black pudding that's going to eat away your armor and your weapons. Just kinda sucks. For every really fun and interesting Ooze, there's another that just makes players want to pull their hair out. Which, a rust monster is a monstrosity, and you can throw that in an archetype and it doesn't bring it down. Like, there are so many other monstrosities that are really fun to fight, and a rust monster has a definitive role. But when so many Oozes are just really kind of shitty monsters to interact with, it does kind of pull the archetype down. One of my favorite monsters to use, though, is an Ooze, and that is the Oblex. The Oblex is a Mind Flayer creation that can copy creatures that it eats, and it's so fun to throw an Oblex in a dungeon and just have this random NPC that the party grows to trust in their adventures within a dungeon, and turns out actually it's an Oblex leading them to their deaths. And you have an epic boss fight, and it's really fun, it's fantastic. But it's not enough to get the Ooze any higher than low B, in my opinion. Then, oh dear, we have the plants. Plants are the worst creature type in D&D 5th edition. There's not enough plants, and the plants we do get are really underwhelming. Like, I think the most iconic plant is a shambling mound. It's a shambling mound. Like, there's not really a lot to say about it. Plants are a very basic creature type in general, and they don't have a lot of support. over the years from Wizards of the Coast. Like, they're not actively trying to make a bunch of creatures for the plant type. I think the best plant by far is the Corpse Flower, which kind of is the plant's version of the Cadaver Collector, where it has a bunch of bodies on it, and it can consume the bodies to regain hit points and to do a few more interesting things. It's just not enough. Like, they don't have a lot of variety there. And especially, like, you can't run plants beyond 7th or 8th level because parties are just going to mow through them. And that's also partially because a lot of them are vulnerable to fire damage. Not really any other of these types are so heavily countered by one of the most common damage types in all of D&D 5th edition. Plants just get cut down like grass, basically. Last but not least, though, we have the undead. And undead, pretty much neck and neck with fiends. They are in S tier type. I mean, undead, despite them, a lot of them being these lower level CR creatures, they hit well above that CR. Undead scale so well with higher parties because so many of their creatures have these fantastic and deadly abilities that just compound on each other. This type has things like shadows, zombies, ghouls, specters, skeletons, all of these essential D&D stat blocks. And also, their most iconic stat block is the Lich, the prototypical D&D big bad evil guy. And the Lich isn't the only boss stat block. You have other things like Mummy Lords in there too, but the undead are just so well rounded out. For their best stat block though, and I will stand by this, I'm going with the Bodak stat block, but not the new one, the old Bodak, the legacy Bodak from Volo's Guide to Monsters. That Bodak can instantly take a character to 0 hit points if they look at it, which is so awesome. Because the Bodak doesn't have a ton of hit points. It has like 58 hit points, but it's something that you can throw at any level party. It's going to make it an interesting, if not potentially deadly encounter, and it's just so flavorful. I'm really sad they changed that stat block, because I know that some players really didn't like it. All you had to do, though, was not look at the Bodak, and you were fine. It just added much more complexity to combats at very little cost. So that rounds out the list. I want to see, do I want to change anything? Am I feeling strongly about changing any of these up? Man, I don't think so. I maybe after the giant updates they'll leap over humanoids just with the work. Dragons. I think I'm gonna say the hags actually are able to leapfrog the dragons here. Beast there. Plants definitely last. Yeah. So this is my tier list for the creature types. There are probably a lot of you that disagree with this heavily, so leave your thoughts in the comments below, and what tier list should I do next? Now, if you want to know where I would rank the Demon Lords on a tier list, check out this video right here, where I, of course, rank the Demon Lords on a tier list. And thank you for entering the dungeon.